Good afternoon or good day, depending on which part of the world or time zone you are. Welcome to the third in the series of seminars, now webinar to celebrate Nigeria's National Day anniversary, the 61st this year. I am Fola Shoboyejo, Executive Director of the Shoboyejo Turning Point Charity Foundation. In collaboration with the Association of Nigerians in Lethbridge and the Southern Alberta Ethnic Association, you are welcome to this seminar. For some, there may not be information or awareness of the activities of the Shoboyejo Foundation. Our mission is simple: to promote and work on educational development and community development. To this end, with the grace of God and the support of people from especially Lethbridge churches and in different parts of the world, we have support. Even in Nigeria, we have completed the reconstruction of a school, the Ogun School in Ifo local government of Ogun State, Nigeria. 3 classrooms, a computer laboratory, toilet building, all with ceramic flooring and aluminum roofing. We have also done 2 seminars in the past. One on immigration and global migration from history to now and going to the future. We also held a seminar in 2019 on the topic of development and democracy, borrowed from the developed countries. Will the model work in developing countries? So this is the 3rd one. We didn't have one last year due to COVID, and we hope you will enjoy it. And for the future, our project is a women and youth center to promote after-school activities instead of kids running into trouble, running around the village and having conflicts with their parents. We are dreaming of a youth and women center where women too can acquire skills in literacy, crafts, and work with the kids on painting, drawing, sculpting, weaving, braiding, fashion designing, haircuts, crafts and welding, small crafts items, and woodwork. And because of the connection of Ogun town to the Adubi War in the 20s, about a century ago, whereby when the war theater was very hot and the conflict was very devastating, the people that escaped from that conflict found refuge in Ogun town. And from our knowledge, based on our knowledge and available information to us, Adubi, the freedom fighter who led the struggle, is remembered in books and stories about the war, Adubi War, but he has not been memorialized. There's no cenotaph to his memory and things like that. So we have space in the lot after developing the Women and Youth Center to have Adubi Heroes Museum built in the place. We also have plans for internet radio where children can express themselves and people can interact on the internet, radio, and learn and teach, and do have all kind of information, local and so forth, about commodities, market days, and local sports and things like that. That is our dream for the future. And even now, before we formally launch the project, we have, contributions already coming in. So this is an opportunity for partnership and for support. Thank you and welcome to the third in the series of our webinars and seminars. And the title is Fake News, Disinformation, Belief Systems, and Truth. Perspectives on navigating a polarized world for peace, development, and happiness. We will have fun today because we are very great speakers. Thank you and welcome.
So I'd like to move on to our next speaker, and that is David Logue, and he's been very patient. David Logue is an associate professor and department chair in the Department of Psychology at the University of Lethbridge. He is a biologist by training and studies how tropical birds use songs to communicate. That's an interesting place to research. David became interested in the psychology of judgment and decision-making while researching how female birds compare song quality from prospective mates. David now teaches a senior level course on judgment and decision-making, in addition to various courses on animal behavior. David is the author of 37 peer-reviewed journal articles on animal behavior. He lives in Lethbridge with his wife and their 2 children. Please welcome David Logue. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Thanks to Fola and everybody else who organized this, and everybody who has taken the time to listen to the talks today. Thanks a lot, and to all my fellow speakers as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychology of fake news today, and just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about here. There we go. Great. Fantastic. All right. So this is what we're talking about. Fake news. I got a few examples here. In this one, Pope Francis is backing Trump. This is not true. This is a pretend story that was shared on Facebook. Another one. So this one, another one. Oh, all right. So there were a bunch of examples of fake news there. And what I'm going to talk about now is how we can use the psychology of judgment to help us discern better as we're dealing with a complex media environment. So when we talk about judgment, what we're talking about is there's something that you don't understand, that you can't understand completely, but you got to try to figure it out. So there's an inference that you have to make about something that's unknown. So things like, if I buy this car, will I be satisfied with it? If I hire this person, is she going to do a good job? If I marry this person, will we have a good marriage? Or in the case of today's topic, if I come across a news story, is it real or is it fake? Right. So here we got a story. Did the FBI find a 9/11 hijacker's plane ticket moments after the North Tower collapsed? Right. So we need to make a judgment about that. Is it real or isn't? So the field of judgment and decision making has come up with studies how people make decisions, and as it turns out, the way that we make decisions isn't as logical as we would like to think. We don't usually lay out all the different options and weigh the possibilities. Instead, we base it on a set of what are called fast and frugal heuristics. So heuristics like a rule of thumb, like a simple rule that you can follow. It usually works out pretty well. The fast and frugal part is that compared to a rational decision process, these rules of thumb work really fast. And they're frugal in the sense that they don't require very much memory or very much cognitive power. I'm going to talk about one in particular. I'm going to emphasize one that's particularly relevant to fake news. And that's this idea of memory availability. All right, we're there. Thanks everybody for helping out with that. So anyway, I went through a few different fake news stories here, things that you typically see on Facebook. People share these kinds of things. A lot of times they have something to make them look more legitimate, like the seal from Harvard Medical School or something like that. But they're all these sort of sensationalized fake news stories. So what I want to talk about today is how the science of judgment can help us understand fake news and filter out fake news, recognize it. So like I was saying before, judgment is about making inferences about the unknown. So trying to figure out something that you can't observe directly. Now I was talking about these different heuristics, these different rules of thumb that we use to make judgments. And the first one that I really want to emphasize is this memory availability heuristic. So it turns out that when people make judgments, one of the key things that they're doing is they're actually trying to recall something, trying to think about something. What your brain does is it says, look, if it's easy to come up with this thing, if it's something that's easy to recall, we perceive that thing as being both truthful and common. There's a ton of evidence on it. So here's an example of results from a study that look at this. In this study, subjects were presented with some idea, some news story, a variable number of times. And then they were asked to rate it for truthfulness. And we can see here by this positive relationship between the number of repetitions and the mean truth rating is that the more somebody hears some story, the more truthful they think it is. These are all fake stories, but just hearing it repeated makes it seem more truthful. I think we can all understand the implications of this for fake news. Here's another example, same kind of thing. It'll come up here in a second, I hope. It's just lagging behind, but a different story. Oh, hey, it's me. So there's a different story here, just one specifically about fake news. Yeah, so I'll just talk through this one then. So this is just a different study. And this one is, again, it's about memory availability, but this used fake news as actual prompts. So the subjects in this one were looking at prompts that were these fake news stories, and they had to rate them as true or false. And they were either exposed to these multiple times or not. And some of them had a flag warning them. One of the earlier speakers was talking about flagging fake news, and some of them didn't. All right, thanks for being patient, everybody. So here we are again. This is about this memory availability heuristic. So this idea that the fluency of recall is actually interpreted as the truthfulness of a statement. And the consequence of this is that if we hear something repeated, even if it's fake, people tend to believe it to be more true. Right? So it's very, very important when it comes to the idea of fake news. In this study, people were presented with prompts like this. So in this one, it's Trump is bringing back the draft is the prompt, right? And people either heard it multiple times or just a single time, and it either had this flag warning or it didn't. You can see the data over there that if it was familiarized, if they'd heard it before, people always seem to think it was more true. Okay, this is this idea of this memory recall heuristic. And if there was a flag, it helped, but not that much. In fact, the effect of hearing it multiple times tended to increase the truthfulness in people's minds more than having a flag tended to decrease the truthfulness. So I think this idea of flagging fake news is important, but it's probably not sufficient, because even when we have something flagged, if we've heard it a bunch of times, people do tend to think it's true even when it's not. So of course we want to think critically, right? We don't want to just take in everything. People have been talking about this all the time. The idea of critical thinking entails obviously thinking slowly, not just responding intuitively to something, but actually trying to break it down and make sense of it. And in the field of judgment and decision making has developed all these tools to be able to do this. In a 20-minute talk, I'm not going to be able to go to those in any detail, but some people earlier mentioned some basic ideas and basic principles like consider all possibilities, weigh the evidence, consider both sides of the argument, all that kind of stuff. And different people have different tendencies with respect to critical thinking. So in this study that I'm showing you the results of right here, initially the subjects were tested for their tendency to use intuitive logic versus deliberative logic. Okay, so they went through a battery of tests to figure out where they fit on that scale. And the people who are most intuitive, kind of followed their gut the most, are represented by the yellow distribution. The people who are most deliberative, thought through stuff the most, they're represented in green. So what we see in these distributions here is that people who are more deliberative are much better at discerning true versus false media than are those who tend to think more intuitively. And you know, obviously there's variance among people, but there's variance within individuals too, right? So as an individual, you can choose to take something more deliberative and not just follow your gut if it's a matter of important news. What, you know, when we talk about critical thinking, it's important to think about what isn't critical thinking, right? What doesn't count as critical thinking? And alternatives to critical thinking include these kinds of ideas like, you know, using your emotions to make decisions, relying on anecdotes. My friend's mother got sick after she got the vaccine, so I don't think the vaccine is healthy, right? Using something that's just plain old common sense or following tradition. These are all alternatives to critically evaluating ideas, critically evaluating evidence. And the idea of using reason is obviously appealing, and that's where we want to go with this. But there's different ways that people use reason. In fact, a lot of the times when we use reason, we're not using reason to make a sound judgment. We're using reason to try to convince somebody of something. So we talk about this as lawyer type reasoning or thinking like a lawyer. And when you're using a lawyer type reasoning, you're using reason, but you're using it to get a point across. Using it to convince somebody of something. And in fact, fake news actually does this all the time, right? Fake news is a lawyer. We don't want to be Joe Pesci here. We want to be Judge Judy. We want to take in all the evidence that's available to us and make a rational decision based on that evidence. Thanks a lot. If you don't mind closing that door, that'd be helpful. Thanks. If somebody's a judge, if somebody's acting like a lawyer, we say they're engaging with motivated reasoning, right? So they're using reasoning, but they're using it for a purpose. They're trying to get something. We do this all the time when we make an argument, for example. One of the things that comes up with fake news is extremely difficult is that fake news doesn't even necessarily have to convince you of anything to do its job. The reality is that there's so much information out there that the addition of more information simply muddies the waters and makes it impossible to come up with a good decision. And we know that from psychology. When choices get really hard, when judgment gets really difficult, what people typically do is they just take the default option or they don't do anything at all. It just gets hard and you just kind of give up and you say, maybe it's impossible to find out, right? And this is something that's bothered me a lot because, you know, I want to be a logical person. I want to be a rational person. I want to be somebody that is open-minded, right? But there's so many different claims. If you pay attention to your Facebook feed or even CNN, there's so many different claims that come up. How can you decide what you need to look into further and what can be safely ignored? And that's a big deal, right? Because we don't have the time to evaluate every claim that comes out. And what I'm going to suggest here is to follow the logic of Bayes' theorem. I'm not going to get into Bayes' theorem in detail, but Bayes' theorem is a way that scientists take what we know and try to add new information to it, right? So this is about how strong are your prior beliefs, how much do you already know, and how likely is this new claim to be true? And if it's the case that based on your prior beliefs and the strength of this new evidence, the claim is very unlikely to be true, give it up. Don't waste your time. But beware of your own lawyer mindset with respect to yourself. Be aware of your own motivated reasoning, right? If you see a claim and you say, I don't want this to be true, so I don't believe it, or I want this to be true, so you do believe it, that's a red flag in my own mind. This is, well, maybe I need to give this a second look. Maybe I need to rethink this because I understand that I have a motivation. I have a horse in this race, and I might want to think it through a little more carefully. So a little bit of practical tips. How do we not become fooled by fake news? We all want to understand the world accurately. We don't want to be hoodwinked, right? Practically speaking, just look for cues of fake news. Fake news is often rather easy to spot because it's trying to do something. It's trying to mislead people. So if there's an appeal to emotion in it, it's something that's trying to get you angry. It's trying to get you excited about something, right? That's not news. That's something else, right? The news doesn't do that. If they're unlikely stories, again, just be a Bayesian. If this is something that is very improbable to begin with, it probably isn't true. If you're being encouraged to spread it, if it's telling you, share this with 10 people, I bet 5 people won't share this. Again, it's probably got an agenda. If there's some obscure source that you've never heard of, probably has an agenda. One thing you can do, practically speaking, to help you identify good news is just to find good news sources. There's this media bias chart. You can find it on the web. Just Google media bias chart, and you'll come up with this. It's a super nice graph. On the x-axis, you've got a measure of right-left bias. On the y-axis, you've got news value and reliability. You know, just stick with the stuff in the upper middle, and you're probably good. The stuff down on the fringes is essentially entertainment. And then in terms of psychological tips to avoid being taken in by fake news, limit your exposure. Don't bathe in that stuff, man. It gets in your head. You got to be careful. If you just hear it repeated enough times, even if it's obviously fake, it has a way of weaving its way into your mind. When you come up with new information, evaluate it like a Bayesian. How confident were you before? how much credibility does this new information have? Right? Those are the things that you need to be asking yourself when you take in new information. And then if it's an important decision, it's an important judgment, think slowly. Consider all the different outcomes and their consequences, and try to be a judge. Try to use your rational mind, not to convince yourself or someone else of something, but rather to evaluate all sides of the claim. If you like this stuff and you're interested and you want to learn more, here are a few resources you could check out. The book Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman is a great introduction to judgment and decision making. The Enigma of Reason is a little bit more academic. It's a little bit of a harder read, but it's a really interesting book. And it's really about this idea that reason evolved and reason is used largely to convince other people of things and as a social tool rather than as a true means to accurate judgment. And what they're saying isn't that you can't use reason for accurate judgment. It's just that we often don't, and it's important to distinguish between the two aspects of reason. The Scout Mindset is a new book. It's really readable. It's a young scientist named Julia Galef. Totally recommend that one. This is really about that judge versus lawyer mindset, and it's about trying to evaluate the world as it is and limit your own motivated reasoning. And then this last one's a program, actually. It's on Netflix. It's called The Social Dilemma. It was a big hit a year or two ago. And it's really about how social media in particular uses psychological tools to keep viewers engaged. Finally, I'd just like to wish everybody a happy Nigeria Independence Day. I know it's a couple weeks late, but then thank you all, and thank you to the Nigerian community of Lethbridge, who's really enriched our community so much. So thank you. Yeah, there's a question in the room and an observation about how much anger there is in society today, and I think surrounding this idea of information and misinformation maybe as well. And I've made the same observation, James. These are difficult times. I really don't feel qualified to say too much about that. I'm not that kind of scientist, you know. I'm not actually a specialist in human emotion or anything like that. So I think I'll probably just refrain from going any further, because it really would just be my own personal opinion. But certainly the emotionality of the argument is not going to bring us to a place of greater rationality or understanding. I think that's one thing I do feel confident about. Although I would only speculate about the causes. Thank you, that was a good question. There's one in the chat here. Is there more that you can explain about the frequency of information being repeated and when it sinks in to become truth in someone else's mind? So just a little bit about that. So this is about the memory availability heuristic. And it's not just about how much something is repeated, it's also about how salient it is, or how strongly we feel it and absorb it. So things that are really memorable, that are paired with, say, graphic images, or that really stick in our mind, often because they involve sex or violence or beautiful people or people we care about. Those are the sorts of things that really can play into this memory availability heuristic most powerfully. And you're going to see that people who are adept at crafting these kinds of messages understand that, and the kinds of messages that they craft are ones that are going to be really easy for us to remember. Yeah, there's tons of evidence on this. So, like, for example, if you just think about, ask people how common are different causes of death, and you list out a bunch of different potential causes of death, and ask average people to comment on how common they are, they vastly overestimate the ones that are graphic and easy to think about. So things like being killed by a shark or a wild animal, or you know, dying in a car accident or something like that. People, or dying by a terrorist is a great example. People point out, you know, terrorist deaths as a major concern, when in fact it's a tiny fraction of a % of people that actually die by terrorism. One more time, thanks again. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak.